The storm rolled in without warning. Rain pounded the windshield as Emily Carter pulled into the hospital parking lot, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The world outside was a blur of gray, somber clouds, slick pavement, the glow of emergency room lights flickering like distant stars through the downpour. She took a breath, held it, then exhaled slowly, willing her hands to stop trembling. She didn't have to be here. No one had asked her. No one expected it. But something deep in her chest had refused to let her stay away. Inside the ICU, 32-year-old Jack Reynolds lay unconscious, his strong frame reduced to stillness beneath sterile white sheets. Machines beeped beside him in quiet rhythm, keeping time with a body that had given everything to save others, and now needed saving himself. 2 weeks earlier, Jack had run into a burning apartment to pull out a mother and her child. He didn't think twice about the risk. But toxic smoke had invaded his lungs and bloodstream before the building collapsed behind him. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize him, but the verdict was cruel: acute liver failure. If he didn't receive a transplant soon, he wouldn't make it. The town of Franklin, Tennessee, rallied. Candlelight vigils, fundraisers, social media posts begging for a match. But the clock kept ticking, and the donor list was long. Too long. Emily wasn't a friend. She wasn't family. She had only seen Jack in passing, on the news, in a local article, smiling in uniform after a rescue. But when she read about his condition, something inside her stirred. A memory of her own father, a firefighter who never came home. A promise she made as a little girl by his grave: "I'll help people. I'll try to save someone, the way no one could save you." She called the hospital the next morning and asked to be tested. Quietly. Privately. She didn't tell her coworkers at the elementary school. She didn't tell her mother. It felt too sacred. And then the call came. She was a match. Now, sitting in the hospital parking lot, watching lightning arc across the sky, Emily swallowed hard. Fear clutched at her ribs, but it couldn't compete with the quiet certainty in her heart. She wasn't just about to donate part of her liver to a stranger. She was about to rewrite both of their lives. Emily Carter had always carried the weight of a quiet heart. She lived in a modest bungalow just outside of Franklin, Tennessee, on a sleepy street where neighbors waved but rarely asked questions. A second-grade teacher at Willow Creek Elementary, Emily was known for her calming presence and gentle smile, the kind that soothed crying children and reassured nervous parents. But beneath that warmth was a woman who had learned to hide her own hurt. Her father, a firefighter, had died when she was 12, rushing into a building that never let him back out. He had been her hero. His loss cracked something inside her that never quite healed. Since then, Emily had grown into a woman shaped by grief, but softened by it, too. She had learned to be strong for others, even when her own strength wavered. Her students became the center of her world, their laughter and curiosity a balm to her spirit. 2 years ago, she had been engaged. The relationship started full of promise but eroded into quiet control, decisions made without her, emotions dismissed, her dreams shelved for his. When she finally walked away, she did so with nothing but a suitcase and the resolve to never let someone make her feel small again. She built a new life piece by piece. A garden full of sunflowers, long walks with her rescue dog, warm tea and quiet books. Still, there were nights when the silence felt too loud, when she'd sit on the porch with her father's old fire jacket draped across her knees and wonder what he'd think of the woman she'd become. Then she saw the article. Local firefighter Jack Reynolds fights for his life after heroic rescue. The photograph showed a man with kind eyes and soot on his cheeks, holding a rescued child wrapped in a blanket. Something in that image struck her, familiar and foreign all at once. The story that followed was short but heartbreaking. Jack had suffered severe internal damage during the rescue. His liver was failing. He had no immediate family left, and time was running out. Emily couldn't stop thinking about him. His bravery. His loneliness. The way the town rallied, but no donor had been found. She clipped the article and pinned it on her fridge. The next morning, she called the hospital and asked how to be tested. Jack Reynolds had spent his life outrunning ghosts. After losing both parents in a car accident at 17, Jack poured himself into the only thing that made sense: service. Becoming a firefighter wasn't just a job, it was a mission, a way to feel connected to something bigger than himself. He trained hard, stayed late, and took every call seriously. To his crew, he was dependable and calm, the kind of man you wanted beside you in the flames. But when the sirens stopped, Jack returned to an apartment that echoed with silence. No siblings. No wife. No one to call when the nights felt too long. He didn't dwell on it too much. Life was about action, and Jack was always in motion. Until the day of the Madison Street fire. The call came in just before dawn. A mother and her young son trapped on the third floor. Jack went in without hesitation. He got them out, but not before the building began to collapse. He collapsed shortly after, struggling to breathe. He woke up in the ICU days later, tethered to tubes and machines. The doctors explained what happened. Smoke inhalation. Toxin exposure. His liver had taken too much damage. He needed a transplant. He stared at the ceiling, his body aching, his mind racing. You need a donor, they told him. But no one in his circle was a match. He didn't even know who to ask. His world had always been about giving. He didn't know how to receive, especially not this much. As the days dragged on, he tried to prepare himself. Maybe this is how it ends. Maybe that was my last fire. Then, out of nowhere, a nurse came in, her eyes bright with something close to hope. A living donor match has been found, she said softly. She wants to remain anonymous, for now. Jack blinked. A living donor. She nodded. A woman. She read about your story. Said she wanted to help. Jack stared at the ceiling again, this time with tears forming. A stranger. Someone he'd never met. Someone who wanted nothing in return. For the first time in a long while, he let himself feel something more than fear. Gratitude. Wonder. A fragile, flickering hope. The surgical suite was bright, too bright. Emily lay on the gurney, heart thudding as she listened to the murmur of nurses prepping her IV. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the hospital blanket. She had signed the consent forms, listened to the risks. There had been plenty. Pain. Recovery. Scars. Even the slim chance of complications. But she never hesitated. In the quiet before anesthesia, she whispered to the nurse, "Can you make sure he's okay?" The nurse gave her a warm, knowing smile. "He's going to be okay because of you." That was enough. The transplant surgery lasted nearly 9 hours. A portion of Emily's healthy liver was removed and transplanted into Jack. Her body would regenerate what she gave. His body, with any luck, would accept the gift, this miracle carved from compassion. Jack awoke groggily the next morning, groaning against the dull ache in his abdomen. A nurse stood beside him, checking vitals. When his eyes flickered open, she leaned close. "It worked," she whispered. "You're stable." The transplant was successful. Jack closed his eyes again and exhaled, his first breath of real relief in weeks. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Do I know who did it?" he rasped. She asked to remain anonymous, the nurse said gently. "She just wanted to help. Said you were worth it." Jack's throat tightened. Worth it. A stranger had risked her life for him, simply because she believed he was worth saving. That thought stayed with him through every groggy hour of recovery. 3 days later, he finally saw her. Emily was being wheeled slowly down the recovery hallway by a nurse, her face pale but glowing with quiet strength. Jack was sitting in a wheelchair, dressed in a hospital gown, gazing out the window. When their eyes met, something invisible passed between them, like recognition, even though they had never exchanged a single word. She smiled softly. "Hi." He swallowed, emotion rising up like a wave. "It was you." She nodded. He opened his mouth, then closed it, eyes glistening. "Why?" Emily looked down, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Because once, someone I loved didn't get the help they needed. And I couldn't do anything. This time, I could. Jack blinked away tears. You saved my life. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. You were already saving others. I just wanted to give you one more chance to keep doing it. Silence stretched between them, thick, full, sacred. Jack finally chuckled, softly. You're a terrible stranger, you know. You kind of ruined me for the rest of them. Emily laughed, wincing at the soreness in her ribs. Sorry about that. Don't be, he said, his voice low, sincere. Don't ever be sorry for being the reason I'm still breathing. The nurses gave them a few more minutes before wheeling them away in opposite directions. But the air had shifted. Something unspoken had taken root between them, something more than gratitude. Something that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in a hospital hallway. Not love. Not yet. But something that made love possible. The weeks after surgery were slow and deliberate, measured in small steps, cautious movements, and quiet conversations. Emily returned home first, her abdomen sore but healing. Her students sent her handmade cards filled with crayon hearts and stick figure drawings. You're a superhero, Miss Carter. One said in bright purple marker. She smiled through tears as she placed each card on her fridge, next to the faded newspaper clipping of Jack. She thought of him more than she meant to. Not just as the man she saved, but as a presence, gentle, grateful, steady. They had exchanged numbers before leaving the hospital. At first, it was just updates. Bloodwork looked good today. Walking without help now. But soon, their messages turned into something else. Jack, what kind of tea do you drink to feel brave? Emily, chamomile. But I add honey when I need courage. Jack, then I'll buy all the honey in Tennessee. They met for coffee one cool autumn morning, just 6 weeks after surgery. Jack still walked with care, and Emily wore a loose sweater that covered her healing scar. They didn't talk about hospitals. They didn't need to. Instead, they sat under golden leaves in the park and talked about everything else. Her students, his firehouse, the books they loved, the silence they feared. Something was blooming between them. Something neither of them dared name too soon. Jack returned to the firehouse in late November, not to fight fires yet, but to sit in the back room, sipping weak coffee with the crew. Laughing again. The chief welcomed him back like a brother. You've always given us everything, the chief said, his voice catching. Now you've been given something back. That stuck with Jack. For years, he had believed his worth came only from what he did, from saving others, from running into the fire. But now, he'd been saved by a stranger who didn't want anything in return. He realized for the first time that his life had value just by being lived. He signed up to speak at local schools about fire safety. Not in his gear, but as himself. Vulnerable, real, and open. At one of those school talks, he stood in the back of Emily's second-grade classroom, holding a paper fire helmet a child had drawn for him. Emily smiled from her desk as her students cheered, Mr. Jack. Later, as they walked to her car, she touched his hand. You're doing more good now than you ever did in the fires. He looked at her then, really looked. So are you. Thanksgiving came, and Emily found herself cooking for two. Jack brought cranberry sauce in a dented tin and an apology for being terrible in the kitchen. They laughed over dry turkey and shared stories of childhood holidays. That evening, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the sun dipping low. I used to think being strong meant never needing anyone, Emily whispered. Jack looked at her, eyes steady. I used to think saving people was all I was good for. She leaned against his shoulder. Funny how a scar can open you up. Jack turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You gave me more than part of your liver, Emily. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. What's that? She asked. He hesitated, searching her face. A reason to believe in something after the smoke clears. In time, the ripples spread further. Emily's act inspired others. A local news station featured her story. Blood donations surged. A regional organ donor registry reported a 22% increase in signups. A little boy at her school told her, "When I grow up, I wanna give people my good stuff too." She hugged him tight and whispered, "That's the bravest thing anyone can do." Jack, now back in full duty, quietly started a foundation in her name, the Carter Gift Project, offering support to patients awaiting transplants and honoring anonymous heroes like her. And every time they passed the hospital where their lives had intertwined, Jack would glance at her and say, "That's where my heart found its home." Not just his health. Not just his second chance. But her. Snow fell gently outside the small cabin in the Smoky Mountains. Emily stood by the window, watching the flakes drift down like quiet confetti. Behind her, the fire crackled softly, its warmth dancing across the hardwood floor. It had been a year. 1 year since the surgery. 1 year since her quiet decision to save a stranger's life. That stranger now stood in the kitchen behind her, no longer pale and weakened, but strong, whole, and fully alive. Jack was plating 2 slices of pie, his face focused and slightly flushed from the heat. "Whipped cream or vanilla ice cream?" he asked. Emily turned to look at him, a tender smile curving her lips. "Surprise me." He brought both and sat beside her on the couch. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that only comes when two people are entirely at ease with each other. Jack glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how weird it is? That you gave a part of yourself to someone you didn't even know?" She nodded slowly. "Not weird. Just right. Like I was meant to." He reached out and gently took her hand in his. "Do you know what the doctors told me after the surgery?" Emily looked up. "What?" "They said your tissue matched better than even most family matches. Like our bodies were speaking the same language." His voice softened. "Kind of poetic, isn't it?" Her eyes shimmered. "Maybe that's why I felt drawn to you before I even knew your name." He shifted, pulling something from his pocket. A small, velvet box. Emily gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Jack held it, not opening it yet. "I spent months trying to figure out how to thank you. How to give you something that could even come close to what you gave me." She blinked back tears. "You already have." He opened the box anyway. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, white gold with a tiny engraving inside the band. Emily lifted it, squinting to read the words, "Life gave me you." Her breath caught. "I'm not asking you because you saved my life," Jack said quietly. "I'm asking you because you changed it. Because you remind me, every single day, that love doesn't wait for perfect timing. It shows up, wounded, scared, brave, and offers itself anyway." Tears streamed freely down Emily's face now. "I don't want to waste a single heartbeat without you in it," Jack whispered. "Will you marry me, Emily Carter?" She didn't speak for a long second, just stared at him, eyes wide and shining. Then she nodded. And nodded again. And finally, through tears and laughter, said, "Yes. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they leaned into each other, foreheads touching. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet white. Inside, two hearts, once strangers, beat in perfect rhythm. Not because of obligation. Not because of fate. But because one small act of selfless kindness had built a bridge between two broken lives, and love had walked across together.